So I want to finish up a lecture we've been touching on for a while, a little bit about the old world and the new world coming together, because that's one of the may even be the biggest environmental story, which is why we kind of keep going back to that. Also, to finish up this thing, this topic that we brought up earlier, right before the midterm, about changing attitudes towards nature, in particular Western attitudes towards nature. So, as we talked a little bit about last week, the discovery of the New World by Europeans and Africans really did um, throw everybody for a loop because it was something, you know, they knew nothing about it. The religion told them nothing about it. The Bible told them nothing about it. And all their science and concept of the world and our place in it was built around the idea that there was only one, there was only the old world. So suddenly this new world changes everything. New species, new animals, new ways of thinking, new cultures. And it was a bit of a crisis, intellectually speaking. But it also changed how we look at nature today. I mean, we can trace this back to this. Um, but again, one of the biggest stories about this, and this is something I know you're familiar with. I don't need to spend too much time on it because this is something that's quite common in textbooks today. An idea that really was only developed in the early 70s. But by the 2000s, it has filtered down to even high schools are talking about it. It's something so big and so obvious that it's kind of funny that nobody really talked about it before. And that's something called the Columbian Exchange, obviously named for Christopher Columbus. Basically, the how the world changed after 1500, both the old world and the new world. The simplest definition is this is the exchange of everything. That doesn't mean just trade, because it is, I notice we don't use the word trade, we do say exchange. So it does involve economic trade, money, things, people like slavery, animals, it also involves bringing species of plants and animals to the New World or vice versa. Think about how food, when you think about the world today, you think about pasta in Italy, but that's Chinese. You think about Swiss chocolate. That's coming from the Aztecs. I mean, both vanilla and chocolate are both Nahua words. When you think about Italy, you might think tomato paste, tomato sauce. Well, tomatoes are coming from Brazil. When you think of Ireland, you might think of potatoes, but those originated in Peru with the Incas. So it's not just things, but also ideas, religions, DNA, people intermarrying with each other, families being blended. But a lot of this was on purpose. A lot of it just kind of happened. Later, we're going to talk about exotics, invasive exotics, and that's going to be part of this story as well. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. And so, again, this is not only changing the Western world, but it's also changing the New World. I mean, this is a new world for Native Americans as well. And again, I know this is familiar to a lot of you, and where the term comes from, and really the idea of looking at this. I mean, it's so interesting when you look back at textbooks and histories of discovery and colonialism. They don't really mention disease. They don't mention the exchange of animals and how that affected history. Um, but Alfred Crosby, which is one of, really one of the forefathers of the environmental movement, which by the way, he's great because his stuff is so easy to read. I mean, it's very scholarly, but it's also so accessible. He initially wrote a book called The Columbian Exchange, which really kind of laid out this thing that everyone after he wrote it was like, why did I think to write this book? Because again, it was just so obvious that it's almost like nobody noticed this. He later writes a book where he takes that idea further called ecological imperialism, where again he really looks at the role of nature in sort of perpetuating colonialism. And of course, what he's mostly talking about in that case would be diseases. So just looking at the just North America, something I do in US one, look at a couple of these expeditions, Hernando de Soto, Ponce de Leon, Francisco Coronado out in the Southwest. And if you look at just the expeditions, they were actually pretty much failures. I mean, the leaders almost always died. I think Coronado actually survived. All the other leaders died. They didn't find what they were looking for, no gold. They didn't do any conquering, no successful colonies. It takes 60 years for the Spanish actually create their first colony in North America. But in some ways, from a much bigger viewpoint, from a colonial viewpoint, from a conquest viewpoint, they actually succeeded. Not only did they bring knowledge of the landscape, but inadvertently, of course, and again, this is something well known today, they spread diseases, even though that was not on purpose. but they were spreading diseases. And that is part of that that Columbian exchange, but it's also a factor in what we now call ecological imperialism. Um, there's a lot of different diseases. The one that seemed to have the most immediate impact and the largest impact was a disease that still would be deadly for all of us today, and that's the disease of smallpox. There were smallpox plagues still happening in Europe and Africa at this point, but um, not as bad as it was in the New World, because there were absolutely no immunities. And even just a few of these microbes that may not have made Europeans sick, in other words, they may be exposed to smallpox, but not necessarily have caught it immediately. It spread like wildfire in the New World. And again, smallpox are what you see on the screen. They're actually these bumps, so kind of like pimples that are very painful. They can burst, they can smell. It disfigures you. Um, to the person who did not survive, but you can see the disfigurement this brings. And even a mild case of it will change the way you look to some degree. If you get it and you survive it, you're immune to it. But there is a high death rate. There are different varieties of it. Some varieties were worse than others. Um, but again, not only did this bring about massive death along with other diseases, but many Native Americans had no idea what this was. And it also caused psychological damage as well. This is from, again, 1530s in Mexico, of drawings of people suffering from smallpox. So again, without getting too much into it today, I mean, there's not only the biological impact of diseases, but even the psychological impact. A lot of these diseases are ones that aren't really major problems today. Measles, mumps, I mean, the MMR vaccination has kind of solved that for us. Although the debate over vaccinations may make that an issue again later. But bubonic plague, flu, malaria, typhoid, these are all old world diseases that are being planted into the new world. What biologists would call virgin soil, because none of these diseases existed in the new world. And as we've already talked about, there was no domesticated livestock, which is where we get most of these diseases from. So again, it's thousands of years of human and microbe history coming together all at once in the new world. And again, like I said, this is common knowledge to you guys. The death rates of this was unbelievable, especially in areas like the Southeast and the Caribbean. Areas with larger populations like the Aztecs, the Incas, and Mayans, as bad as it was, they could withstand it a little bit more. But it was some of those smaller areas that had connections like trade routes, but the populations were smaller. It was actually much more devastating because they reach a breaking point much quicker. But again, you can imagine all the different ways that diseases could affect Native American life. And again, an example of really changing the history of the Americas because of microbes, because of the environment, in other words. But that discovery of the New World, kind of getting away from that, um, changed how Westerners thought of science, how they thought of nature. Thomas Hobbes, who you might know from political science circles, he also was somebody, he was a naturalist. We say scientist today, that's actually a more modern word, but he was a naturalist. And he definitely believed humans had the right to use nature, including eating, hunting, and eating animals. But he also scoffed at the idea that the earth was created for humans. He just said, well, we're just one of many creatures here on earth. He had to, you know, really taken us out of the center of nature. And again, a lot of people were moving in that direction by the 1700s. So again, this what we call the scientific revolution, a term that we coined in the 30s and retroactively applied to the late 1600s and 1700s in Europe, which is where we really get ideas of modern science from. It really was a change in how people thought of their place in nature. The idea that maybe the world wasn't fully created just for humans. Earth is not the center of the universe. That actually in our solar system, and of course that's a modern word, solar system meaning the sun and the system around the sun, and heliocentric system that was discovered in the 15 and 1600s. And that was a major change in how people thought. And then with the development of telescopes, the realization that there are many solar systems out there. Now we kind of have a concept of how big the universe really is. There's also going the other way. We see people like Robert Hooke with the microscope discovering just in a drop of water, a whole nother universe, the microscopic universe. In other words, there's just like the New World was something we didn't know about, we in the West didn't know about. There's all this other stuff we don't know about. And so that really changes. First off, we got to discover this stuff, but also changes our earlier concepts of, thinking that we had the whole world figured out, if you will. Um, and again, the New World itself was part of this, but also discovering things like geology, and geological time, that the Earth is obviously much older than we thought, and that there's these other forces at work, geological forces that we can't see with the visible eye because it's so slow, but we can see evidence of it in things like strata in the rock and volcanoes and fossils and things like that. So suddenly we're starting to change how we think of nature and our place in it. And one of the things that we see is this idea that you study plants and animals not because of how they're going to help us necessarily, just because they're there, they're important, they have their own merits. The rise of natural history, the natural sciences, which wasn't really a huge thing. If you knew about plants or animals, it was more like, what kind of medicine can we get from herbs? How can we use animals to eat or make into products? Now, what we now call botany and biology and all these sciences that you're taking in schools, this is what they're developing. So in class, we did a quick assignment. You might remember these words. What I was actually testing was it's what's called Umwelt, which is a German word. It, it's used in biology a lot. It's kind of how a species perceives the world. Snakes might perceive the world more through taste. Bats might perceive the world more through sound. We kind of use a combination of senses, although I think we tend to be much more visual than we tend not to taste the world outside of food, right? Um, but also, not only do each species kind of perceive the world differently, uh, also individual, even though we're all humans, we do have slightly different ways of perceiving the world. A good example of this is humans do seem to have a need to name things. I mean, the name of this lecture, I didn't put the title card up, is naming nature. Naming nature, the idea you name something, you control it, you understand it. All cultures name nature in some ways. But at the same time, we do it slightly differently from individual to individual. For instance, in science, we see what we call lumpers and splitters. And I think I might have talked about this with human evolution earlier. So if you put a bunch of fossils, like a bunch of different, um, let's just say, human ancestor fossils, a bunch of skulls, some people will go, oh, there's 20 fossils here. Well, I see 18 different species. I see slight differences. Somebody like me, who's a lumper, will go, oh, I see maybe four species. So they're all pretty close to the same. In other words, some of us tend to lump things together, and some of us also tend to split things apart. And oddly enough, I think you can actually even explain relationships this way. Are you more detail oriented, or are you a little more kind of, again, lumping things together? When I see colors, I mean, I can see the differences in colors, but also just say, oh, that's just, those are all blue, those are all red. But other people will see, really distinct differences in color. Musicians will hear things that the rest of us don't hear. People who drink wine, some people really do taste all those different notes. Others, like me, just it tastes like wine. It tastes pretty good, but I don't really taste all of it. So we all kind of have our own Umwelt, but as a species, we also have kind of a shared one. That's why this exercise that I made you guys do, even though a couple of people always go slightly against it, I, when we see a shape and we hear a sound, we all tend to put the same shape and sounds together. In other words, there is a shared Umwelt that we have. And it does actually explain what we call taxonomy, this idea of naming nature scientifically. Carl Linnaeus is the one that kind of invented the modern science of taxonomy. Although he wasn't as scientific as you might think. A lot of it was he would touch things and smell things and even taste things. And, oh, this kind of tastes alike. Although most of his broad categories we still maintain to this day. His first taxonomy was only about 20 something pages. Now it would be thousands of pages as we've discovered more and more species, and we've discovered DNA, which also allows us to lump things together in ways that we couldn't earlier. But again, all cultures do this, and we all kind of do it in the same basic way. Bugs, birds, reptiles, mammals, fish, plants, animals. We may use different words, but we all kind of perceive the world the same way and see pretty much the same broad categories. Not only that, but many cultures do a binomial system. In other words, two names for a species. So even though Carl Linnaeus invented the one we use, it is something that we still see out there in other cultures as well. He used Latin for the most part. He tried to stay away from naming things after people, although he did name a few plants after people he didn't like. But uh, he did have kind of set rules. And again, for the most part, we still use his basic system today. For instance, Homo sapiens, wise man, comes from Carl Linnaeus. Um, and again, we can see this even pre-scientific revolution. I mean, you go back to the Judeo-Christian Bible. And by the way, this is the Henry VIII Bible on one side and the King James Version on the other side. And again, you go back to the story of creation. And there's technically two stories. There's the 7 days story that we all know, but a little bit later in Genesis, there's also the story of God creating new animals and Adam naming them as they're being created. And again, he's doing taxonomy right from the beginning. Um, so what we begin to see with the rise of what we now will call biology and botany, what they called natural sciences, and taxonomy and astronomy and geology, is this idea that science can help explain the world. And again, we start seeing these ideas of science being applied to government and society as well. There is a shift from not a shift from belief in God necessarily, but not necessarily saying God does everything. This idea that there are natural laws. Maybe God created those natural laws, but natural laws are actually driving it. I mean, it's the idea of the clockmaker that you've always heard. I mean, there's a clockmaker that makes the clock, but then it runs on its own. That the world maybe was still created by God, but it's running on its own. And we can explain that world in the same way we can explain how a watch works. What we also see is ideas like deism, the idea that maybe there's a God, but he is not directly involved in our daily lives. And that's we do see some, beginnings of what we now will call agnosticism and atheism as well. But most people were still quite religious, but in the same way, most people, for instance, the US, I mean, we're still 90% religious in this country. Um, but yet most people don't think a demon is making their car not run or that God is punishing their child because they have cancer. We think about microbes and medicine and again, modern science. So even if you're still religious, we do think scientifically. And this is where those ideas are coming from. And again, that's going to change how we think of nature. Scientific revolution leads to what we call the Enlightenment. I mean, to me, these two things kind of overlap. This is basically taking some of the ideas of looking for proof and evidence, but applying it at the social level. I mean, again, something like democracy, a constitution that logically lays out a government. I mean, the US is the best example of the Enlightenment, in my opinion. Again, that's coming out of that scientific revolution to a large degree. And again, the idea that the standard of truth is reason, not just belief, not just this is the way you've always done things. Again, think about like royalty. Why are you king? Well, my dad was king, so therefore I'm king. And a democracy would say, well, what's the proof that you're any better than any of us at running things? So again, when people run for election, for instance, what they're supposed to be doing is kind of scientifically proving to you that they're the best person for the job. Although, as you political science students know, so much of democracy is run by emotion and political persuasion and loyalty to parties and things like that. But it's supposed to be this enlightened, really kind of scientific process, right? Um, and so again, everything we do, we submit to reason. And again, that's coming out of what we now call the scientific method. One of my favorite Enlightenment writers is a guy named David Hume from Edinburgh, Scotland. He was kind of one of the first modern day historians, but he was also very anti-religious. And so Enlightenment, and I'll come back to that. Enlightenment writers were always trying to create their magnum opus, their big project, their science of man, if you will. And they all try to do this. They're going to write a study of religion, a study of economics, a study of morality, a study of government, a study of history. But they never get done. They publish a couple of these and then they die of old age. But he started this kind of idea. And one of his Science of Man projects was a book called A Natural History of Religion. The title itself was controversial because he's explained religion not from a supernatural deistic version, but literally we can explain this naturally. And he was very popular, but he was also highly controversial. And there's a very famous story of David Hume. Uh, he was walking back home in Edinburgh one night. He was drunk. He was already pretty famous. He fell into the Loch Lake there that was full of sewage because this is where all the city sewage was in this lock. And he fell in. He had a little bridge going across. And he fell in. He's having a hard time getting out. The story goes, a woman, older woman, came by, kind of a working class person, saw him. He said, "Can you help me get out?" And she said, "You're David Hume." "Yes." "You don't believe in God, do you?" "No." "Say the Lord's Prayer." And he does. He recites it. And she said, "I knew you knew it." She just kind of humiliated him, and then she helped him out. And I always use that as an example of how the Enlightenment changed society, because if you study European history, you would know that a couple hundred years earlier, the fact that he was not religious, she might have let him die. But again, there's this idea of we have tolerance of different ideas and new ideas, and anyway. But one reason I like Hume is that he was, although I don't know if I would like him personally, he wasn't always the nicest person, but he believes history was important. That it's good stories, it can be entertaining, it helps us learn about the world and knowledge, and it makes you a better person. So, he praised my career, so my profession. So, um, and actually, not to be all about Scotland, but actually, a lot of Enlightenment ideas did originate in Scotland. People like James Hutton, who created new ideas about geology, one of the first people to really talk about how old the Earth really is. Uh, going against people like Newton that said the Earth is only 6,000. They're like, seems to be a little bit older than that. People like James Watt, and you guys just learned about the Industrial Revolution. He was the guy that one of the first people to really harness steam power to make machinery go, which literally fueled uh, the first industrial revolution. So, with these new ideas, new ways of looking at the world, being open to new ideas, we do begin to see the rise of real natural history and even the idea of conserving nature, which is kind of a preamble to the environmental movement of the 20th century. You start seeing things like botanical gardens, which is this idea, it's kind of like if you think about it, it's like a plant zoo. You organize the plant world by species and genuses and kingdoms and all of this, and you're kind of putting the plant world in microcosm. Again, it's like literally like a plant zoo. Things like the Royal Society, which again is the first of these is in London, but we see them all over Europe and later in America and other places. Basically, initially funded by King Charles II. But these societies that are there to promote sciences and new ideas and even debate these ideas, but do it in a safe way. No one's getting persecuted for having a different idea. By the 1700s, if you were an educated person, you would have what was called a cabinet of curiosities. For public history students, you might know this because this is the beginning of modern day museums. You would not only have artifacts from history and lots of books in your library, but it's have all kinds of natural stuff, seashells and fossils and stuffed animals. And I mean, the Smithsonian Institute was partly, some of the stuff in the Smithsonian Institute we get from Jefferson. Jefferson had his own cabinet of curiosities at Monticello. So this is something that, you know, an educated person was interested in the world, the natural history, the human history of the world, art. And again, this does evolve into things like the Natural History Museum in London, which is the first of these types of museums. Now, every major city has a natural history museum. You even have one, right up the road from me in Albany, Georgia. There's one down the road from me in Gainesville, Florida, the Florida Natural History Museum. We started this talking about a few weeks ago about views of nature. And nature was seen as dark, it was satanic, it was a place humans aren't supposed to be. We come out of nature, we don't live in nature. If you go back to the 1600s, say London, it was very common to see things like what was literally called bear baiting, where you would tie a bear to a post and beat him until he just went wild. Or they would have, fights where a lion and an elephant would go at it. You paid money to see these animals tear each other apart. Or things like cockfighting or dog fighting, where people place bets again on animals that are basically just killing each other. What we now would call animal cruelty. That starts to change. We can even see this in the 1600s. The colony of Massachusetts in 1641 passes the very first law against animal cruelty. By the late 1700s, the idea that a civilized, decent, moral person is not mean to animals. That if you're going to kill them, you do it in a humane way. You don't go out of your way to be cruel. And that's something that has kind of evolved even in recent times. I know my father talks about when he was a kid in the 50s. It was still pretty common to put firecrackers and frogs and blow them up. He always talks about one time he had his dog in his front yard and and the car literally swerved to hit his dog. So even in the 20th century, we still see a lot of cruelty to animals that in 2025 we've kind of gotten away from. You can see the beginnings of compassion. One person wrote the compassion for brute creatures, even developing in the 1700s. Again, it was this idea of a change in relationship with nature. The reason I have an orangutan here is that people like Carl Linnaeus didn't quite know how to handle apes. Apes weren't common in Europe, but once they began to learn about apes, they were uncomfortable because they were very human-like. And in fact, Linnaeus initially put apes in the same group with humans, although now we technically separate humans from apes. We are still pretty closely related. Um, but we do see this idea of more of a focus on animal welfare, especially as we get into the 1800s. Some of this is coming out of science. The more we know about animals and the way they behave, the more we seem to care about them. Even going back to religion, you can definitely look at the Bible and see kind of environmental ideas that we're stewards of the earth. We're here to take care of the earth. We're shepherds, right? This idea of we take care of each other in the same way shepherds take care of animals, right? They don't abuse them. So, but also as we are as a species moving more to cities and we're getting modern medicine, we're living longer. We don't need to fear nature with where diseases were, uh, where you got cold, where now we have air conditioning, we have heat, we have modern day clothes, we have modern day transportation. Nature is no longer something to be feared. And plus, you always want what you don't have. As you move into cities, you kind of pine for the forest. When you're in the forest, you're like, I don't want to be here, and so again, this idea that we're really connected, you know, that we're all part of this natural world. And again, it really changes everything. Once you get to the 1800s, um, nature has taken a totally different tone. We see it as restorative, peaceful, a place to get away from the evils of cities and pollution and human crime and all of this. And also that it's fragile, it needs protection. We need to conserve it. Um, and again, that this is part of what we're supposed to do, even from a religious viewpoint. This is what we're supposed to be doing. That God gave us the earth, and we're supposed to take care of it, not just use it to death, right? So whether you're religious, not religious, there was a change in how you thought of nature. And of course, this is going to further feed into science and natural history and human history as well. And again, if you look around the world at this time, and this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of big cities, but something we'll talk about more later, the rise of pollution. It was becoming kind of nastier and smellier and grosser. And as people are living together, there's more diseases and more crime. And this suddenly didn't feel like where God lived. This felt more like where the devil lived. And of course, you get the rise of things like Jack the Ripper and all that. So again, nature suddenly felt like a place you wanted to go to get away from that. Okay, so that's my kind of real quick version of this. I skimmed over a lot of really kind of important stuff, but just want to give you an idea of this change in attitude. Anyway, thanks guys, and I will see you next week.